The village of Porto Ercole lies on the south coast of Monte Argentario in Italy. It's a tourist resort today, and tomorrow it will be another little Miami on the Mediterranean. But for most of its history, Porto Ercole was simply one of 100 other poor, unremarked villages on the Tuscan coast. Its products were sardines, olives, rough wine, and malaria. And unlike most other towns in Tuscany, nothing happened in it for centuries. In fact, Porto Ercole only ever entered once, and very briefly, into what we are pleased to call the history of culture. Because it was here, upon July 18th, 1610, that one of the greatest of all Italian painters, Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, died. People had in fact been trying to kill him for several months, but he died of mistaken identity. He was trying to sneak back into Rome, from which he had been banished by papal edict 3 years earlier, and a passing boat dropped him off on this beach at the Fenilia, 100 miles north of Rome. And at this point, the Spanish garrison officers who controlled the area, who were every bit as officious and inquisitive in the 17th century as they are today, assumed that he was a spy or an escaped convict, and they clapped him in jail. It took them all of 2 days to work out that the stinking, blaspheming gamecock that they had behind bars was not the man they wanted, and not, in fact, their legal concern. But by that time, Caravaggio had caught malaria because, up to as late as 1945, this whole coast was infested with mosquitoes. And so, when they let him out, he discovered that the felucca that he had come in had left. It was hull down, out there, on the horizon, with everything that he owned in it. His books, his clothes, his pictures, and his well-used sword. And so down this beach he ran, according to local legend, frantic, and here on the Fenilia, he died of rage and of fever. He had no goods, no friends, and he was not quite 39 years of age. Because Caravaggio's death was of a piece with his life, lonely and violent, both have conspired since to create a legend. Caravaggio was the first incarnation of one of the favourite myths of modern art, the violent outsider who bursts the conventions and suddenly changes the language. We're at the end of this legend of the avant-garde, but Caravaggio and his critics helped to start it. He came from the provinces, and he took the name of the town that he was born in, Caravaggio, not far from Bergamo. His true family name was Michelangelo Merisi, and his father, Fermo Merisi, was a builder, a clerk of works, not quite an architect, somewhat up from a stonemason. His parents were married in January 1571, and he was born the same year.
Lucy, a daughter of Signor Giovanni Giacomo Oratori, was married to Master Fermo, a son of Bernardino Merisi, on the 14th of January 1571 in the church of Saints Peter and Paul in Caravaggio.
There wasn't much art to look at in the town beyond these unremarkable wall paintings by Fermo Stella. We don't know how or why Caravaggio became a painter. His father died in 1584 when he was 13, and his family apprenticed him to an artist called Simone Peterzano, who claimed to have studied under Titian. Caravaggio studied in Milan for 4 years, sweeping the studio floor and learning the nuts and bolts of drawing. Peterzano's speciality was doing frigid and cluttered pastiches of Michelangelo, like this altarpiece. This contract of apprenticeship was quite specific.
Anno Domini 1584, on the 6th day of April, this covenant was solemnly stipulated between Michelangelo Merisi, son of Mastro Fermo of the parish of San Giorgio in Pozzo Bianco, and the noble Mastro Simone Petrazzano, son of Mastro Francesco of the same parish, whereby the contractual parties undertake to scrupulously adhere to the following rules and conditions. 1. That the said Michelangelo will lodge with Mastro Simone in order to learn the art of painting, and will live there for 4 years. 2. that this will commence as from today, and Michelangelo will practice this art day and night faithfully and as well as the art requires. 3, that he will carefully avoid to damage or soil any part of the property of Mastro Simone, while Mastro Simone will keep Michelangelo in his house and his studio and will train him in the art of painting to the best of his ability, so that at the end of the 4th year his pupil should be able to work of that art and on his own account.
There was plenty of first-rate painting to be seen in Milan in the late 16th century, and one of the artists Caravaggio seems to have looked at carefully was Lorenzo Lotto, who had emigrated to Lombardy. There's a suaveness of light and modelling in Lottos like this Rest on the Flight into Egypt, a silvery pastoral elegance that Caravaggio was clearly trying to repeat in early pictures like this one. The same subject, done in Rome around 1595 when he was 24. And the mood reminds one, however distantly, of Giorgione, the tired family in that soft and leafy wilderness, soothed by the binding power of music. In 1588, the apprenticeship ran out. He went back to his hometown and sold some land he'd inherited, and presently he set off for that capital of late 16th century art, Rome. We don't know how he got there. It was probably via Florence. And if he did stop in Florence, he would certainly have seen the fresco cycle, which had served artists as a lexicon of gesture and a criterion of realism for 150 years. The paintings by Masaccio in the Brancacci Chapel of Santa Maria del Carmine. Perhaps it's not fanciful to think that Caravaggio's whole sense of action and how to paint it was influenced by the large, legible gestures of Masaccio's figures, and that some part of his realist instinct was confirmed here. Anyway, he got to Rome around 1592, an ambitious 21-year-old, scrabbling for a living in a city full of unemployed and some unemployable artists, Italians, Germans, Dutch, Spanish, French. He churned out heads, 3 a day, for a Sicilian dauber named Lorenzo. Then he was taken under the wing of a minor papal diplomat called Pandolfo Pucci, who earned the nickname of Monsignor Insalata by feeding him on salad 3 meals a day. Better than starving, but not much. Finally, he got something resembling a professional start with an artist 5 years older than he was, Giuseppe Cesari, who called himself the Cavaliere d'Arpino. The Cavaliere was an exponent of the most frigid sort of late Roman mannerism, with its serpentine figures a long way after Michelangelo, its prissy, involuted shapes, its idealism and decorum, and general horrified recoil from the juices of life. It's hard to imagine a painter as concrete as Caravaggio working for this feeble creature, but a job was a job, and besides, the Cavaliere had connections. At some point during Caravaggio's first years in the city, an Englishman arrived here, a young pamphleteer named Thomas Nash, who in 1597 published a splendid picaresque novel based upon his own wanderings about Europe, called The Unfortunate Traveller, and it's still not by any means the worst of guides to Caravaggio's Rome. Italy, the paradise of the earth and the epicure's haven, how doth it form our young master? It makes him to kiss the hand like an ape, to cringe his neck like a starveling, and to play at hey, pass, repass, come aloft when he salutes a man, and from hence he brings the art of epicurizing, the art of atheism, the art of whoring, and the art of sodometry. Granted, Nash had all the Elizabethan bigotry against Italy, that land of Romish Machiavels, but about its pecking order, he was absolutely right. No artist had any chance of success, or even, in fact, very much of survival, unless he managed to turn himself in some degree into a courtier, attaching himself to one of the great families of Rome with their houses like Palazzo Spada here, or Palazzo Doria Pamphili, Palazzo Barberini, or Palazzo Farnese. At first, this world of the big commissions was closed to Caravaggio. His earliest known paintings are modest, single figures, still lives, like the so-called Sick Bacchus, which probably was a self-portrait done after a bout of malaria, which we know that he went to a Rome hospital to recover from. The flesh is rather fuzzy and inert, and the drawing of the figure is capable but routine so far. But though he doesn't handle animate forms so well, Caravaggio is precocious with still life. He gives you the full density and presence of every fruit in that basket, the ripeness of the peaches, the bloom on the grapes, the springy curve of the vine leaf stalks. In the process, he became one of the first artists to turn still life into a type of painting, and so begin the tradition that would run on through Chardin to Georges Braque. He took an object, and he made it a subject, distinct, specific, against a neutral backdrop, nothing else to look at. Now, at the end of the 16th century, the supreme test and subject for the artist was the human figure. Still life, what a connoisseur called the ability to reproduce flowers and similar trifles, was at the very bottom of the painter's hierarchy. But not for Caravaggio. There was, he declared, no difference at all between a figure and a leaf. Both were equally demanding, each needed tanta manifattura, the same degree of handiwork.
Whether you paint a flower or a human figure, you have to devote the same amount of good work.
But the young painter also had to learn his anatomy if he was to compete with the rest of the artists in Rome. Giovanni Baglione, who wrote a series of lives of his fellow painters, which are better remembered than his own paintings, commented rather patronizingly.
He also made a boy bitten by a lizard, which had appeared from a thicket of flowers and fruits, and truly the boy's head looked as it was shrieking, and the whole composition was diligently worked out.
There were social lessons too. He must learn to dance attendance upon lords and papal princes, because the free art market for living artists, as we understand it today, the system of dealers and galleries, had really only just begun to come into existence at the start of the 17th century. Therefore, you needed a patron, somebody who'd collect your work and fix you up with introductions to the relevant monsignori so that you could get church commissions, and in general, plug you in some way into Roman society on however menial a level. And in return, you could be expected to do just about anything from painting to pimping. Now, curiously enough, despite his ruinously evil temper, Caravaggio never lacked patrons of this sort. The consumers of art liked him right from the first. It was only the connoisseurs that felt slightly nervous about his formal innovations. His problem, therefore, was never rejection, but rather a ruinous incapacity to behave like the success that he really was. Caravaggio was only 24 when, in 1595, he met his first Maecenas, the man whose tastes were to do so much to shape his own early imagery. He was a prince of the church, no less, and a close friend of Pope Clement VIII. He had a vast palace near Piazza Navona and almost unlimited funds at his disposal, and his name was Cardinal Francisco Maria del Monte. The cardinal was in his mid-40s and the occupant of this palace when he met Caravaggio. He was one of the most enlightened collectors in Rome and one of its more heroic pederasts. Palazzo Madama, where he gave lavish drag balls in the 1590s, has since become, by a certain irony, the headquarters of the Roman Senate. Caravaggio took up his lodging there in 1596, and he settled down to painting what the cardinal liked. His taste seems, on the whole, not to have varied. A round, fleshy face framed by a pompadour of curly hair like black whipped cream, opaque eyes, an expression of sweet, libidinous dumbness. One of Caravaggio's images was so very androgynous that it was miscatalogued for centuries. This lute player, now in the Hermitage. From Bellori in the 17th century to Bernard Berenson in the 20th, it was thought to be a girl, which of course it is not. Caravaggio painted it for the Cardinal del Monte in 1596, remarking when he'd finished that it was the best thing that he'd ever done. And in detail, one can see why. The still life on the table, as one of his contemporaries remarked, is exquisitely counterfeited, right down to the last drop of condensation and the last bit of light on the musical instrument. Other commissions came from the Cardinal's friends, like the Marchese Giustiniani, who had him do this painting of Victoria's love. A prudish German friend named von Sandrart urged the Marchese, who owned 13 other Caravaggios, to hang this one behind a curtain. And one can see why, because it's the triumph of sex over culture. A very unideal young Cupid, fresh off the piazza, clambering out of bed with a raunchy grin on his face. He's trampling on a whole litter of objects which symbolize the disciplines of mind and imagination that Giustiniani, that eminent humanist, so conspicuously valued when in the salon. Architecture, the square and compasses, music, the score, the violin and the lute, and even the armor symbolizing military glory. The last time that this sexual type got centre stage in Caravaggio's work was in this picture here in the Uffizi in Florence. It's very elaborate, very highly finished, and in fact a presentation piece. It's the same plump, heavy-lidded catamite that Caravaggio had painted so many times before for the Cardinal del Monte, and probably, in fact, he existed in real life. What we're probably looking at is the Cardinal's favourite boyfriend, but this time tricked out in the mythological drag appropriate to Bacchus, the god of wine and orgy. What an oppressive picture it is. It exudes the same kind of hothouse feeling as some portraits by Ingres 2.5 centuries later, those sleek, plump Second Empire pleasure machines with their tropical hands. But Caravaggio was in his 20s, and of course he couldn't draw as well as Ingres, and certainly he was having trouble with that peculiarly coarse line of the shoulder there. But never mind, because the fascinating thing about this picture is the extent to which Caravaggio took over the existing stereotypes for painting a desirable female nude, say of Venus, and applied them to a man. This person is nothing other than an object. He offers himself to your gaze with a kind of lustful passivity tinged with sarcasm. Seen it all, done it all. There's nothing heroic about him at all. He's a long way from the classical Renaissance nude. And instead, you have these rather coarse proletarian muscles run to seed in the palace. The body exists in exactly the same way as the still life does. It's a flawed object among other objects, slightly too ripe, rather too soft. And the painting, in fact, that this most reminds me of was painted almost 300 years later by another great realist, Edouard Manet, and it is, of course, the Olympia, a portrait of a female courtesan this time, exhibiting herself with precisely the same mixture of arrogance and irony. But that is purely a coincidence. Manet could never have seen this Bacchus. It wasn't discovered in the basement of the Uffizi until 1916. 1590s, most mannerism in Rome had degenerated into this kind of high-flown ornament, an assembly of decorative stereotypes. Its peculiar artificialities were already coming under attack from younger artists, and Caravaggio presently became their accepted leader, because he was interested in what seemed to be plain speech rather than rhetoric. He painted from life, from models, and made a point of it. It was here, Piazza Navona, that Caravaggio would hang out and find his models. Now, in ancient Roman times, this square used to be the circus of Diocletian, but even in Caravaggio's day, I imagine it could not have looked very much like this. There was no Church of Sant'Agnese there. That obelisk did not exist. Bernini's Fountain of the Four Rivers had not yet been conceived. The whole place was dusty and ill-paved and packed, but it was an amazing theatre of human action. And in that respect, it has not changed. Piazza Navona was one of the hubs of Rome, both for the rich and for those who lived off the flank of the rich. The whores and the hustlers, the gypsies, as well as the cardinals, and the odd English tourist, and even the occasional Spanish diplomat. The stock of types and costumes and gestures that Caravaggio was to accumulate in such places as this was going to nourish his art for the rest of his life. And on the street, he found a vitality that could not be matched by any pattern book.
He called a gypsy woman that happened to be passing in the street and took her to his lodging, where he drew her in the act of telling the future, as these women of the Egyptian race are accustomed to do.
These scenes of Caravaggio's, with their gypsies and card sharps and suckers being fleeced, would soon be imitated throughout Europe, and they became a standard kind of picturesque genre. But his pictures also look back to the 15th century, and especially to Giorgione. Not just in the shadowed faces and the sense of intimate colloquy, or in the subtle theatre of expression, but in costume too. As a matter of fact, by the 1590s, the fashion for bright colours and gaudy display had completely gone out of Rome, and a kind of fanatical Spanish sobriety, all black, had taken its place. And so, like the hippies and the freaks of the 60s who used to preen themselves here on Piazza Navona in their Moroccan plumage and their Edwardian tat, Caravaggio's street models wore a kind of defiant historical fancy dress, almost a century old, suggesting perhaps a wistful desire for romantic flash amid the bureaucratic austerities of the Counter-Reformation. Up to now, Caravaggio had only done a few religious paintings. This was the first and the most primitive, St. Francis in Ecstasy, painted around 1592. Night beside a river. The moon leaves a few streaks on the water, but otherwise the landscape is unintelligible, a black wedge. St. Francis has had his vision of God. It's overwhelmed him, and he swoons into the arms of an angel who bends over him like a lover. The angel is the usual early Caravaggio boy, half naked, the shoulder gleaming in the dark. The finger of his right hand is hooked under the saint's girdle, and the whole image is suffused with eroticism. But then the likeness of spiritual and sexual ecstasy was one of the big themes in religious art and poetry in the 17th century. The other early religious pictures looked rather less devout. This is St. Catherine of Alexandria, and it's a more sophisticated composition, and Caravaggio must have had some enjoyment from painting the elegant lines of the palm frond and the sword, and also the sadism of his later work is beginning to announce itself in the contrast between those steel tusks on the wheel and the girl's soft shoulder, and in the reflection of that red cushion on the sword tip, like blood. But this is not a sacred picture. It's a portrait of a handsome woman in saint's costume, and this secular realist bias wasn't lost on his audience.
He depicted a girl seated on a chair, her hands in her lap, in the act of drying her hair. He painted her in a room, and by adding on the ground a small jar of ointment with trinkets and jewels, he would have us believe that she was the Magdalene.
Thus Bellori described Caravaggio's Magdalene. And it did look secular, being so terse. The body language of penitence comes down to a slump of the shoulders and one tear on the side of the nose. A Roman girl in her Sunday best, sitting in a dingy bare room with a tiled floor. But there's a triangle of light up there on the wall, and that patch is a premonition. It reads as nature, sunlight from a hidden window. But it's also meant to suggest the grace of repentance creeping into Mary's soul, and this way of using realist effects for symbolic ends would become quite central in Caravaggio's work because it eased the conflict between allegory and realism. He wanted to be credible. He wanted to locate the miraculous in the matrix of everyday life, which is where it first happened in the Bible. And the first picture in which he brought that off was the supper at Emmaus. The risen Christ reveals himself to his disciples while breaking bread in an inn, and St. James's arms spring out in amazement, in a mimicry of crucifixion, by the way. Another disciple is halfway out of his chair with shock, and the innkeeper has no idea of what's going on. Nor do we at first, because the bread, which you'd expect to be the focus of the picture, is half hidden behind that chicken and eclipsed by Caravaggio's favourite fruit basket perched there on the edge of the table. It's a curious combination of religious drama with the casualness of everyday life, and one wonders what the Roman connoisseurs made of that frayed apostolic elbow with a hole in it, shoved in their eyes. Well, the answer is that they didn't like it at all, because such things offended their sense of decorum. Later, Bellori would even complain that Caravaggio's realism was out of kilter, because, as he pointed out, the meeting at Emmaus took place after the resurrection, in the spring, and the fruit in that basket are autumn fruit. But decorum was essentially abstract. It involved, first of all, a high level of style. It meant continuous modelling, such as you got in Raphael, the obedient light passing over a shape and not calling too much attention to itself. And in narrative painting, it also called for a dignified and steady unfolding of stories, a consistent fictional tone without sudden flashes and grand dramatic climaxes. Caravaggio now set himself to break every single one of these rules. He painted a Medusa for the Cardinal del Monte, and to make it look more real, Caravaggio painted it on a convex boss of wood covered in canvas to simulate the round shield in which Perseus saw the reflection of Medusa's head. He painted the sacrifice of Isaac, and to show a knife like that, you must know how to use one. Abraham holds his son the way a fisherman grips a big fish just back of the gills while gutting it, and only a connoisseur of violence would show you that thick, implacable thumb forcing Isaac's head down on the altar and that squalling mouth. But the most extreme image from this time was Caravaggio's Judith and Holofernes, which he painted in the late 1590s. It's guignol of the most specific sort. The story of the young Jewish heroine killing the foreign tyrant had been done by many another artist before, but never with this macabre intensity. Blood, darkness. Blood streaming from Holofernes' neck, darkness washing over his muscles, holding the figures motionless in the middle of violent action. A real tableau. Another artist might have made Judith lean forward and deprived her stiff pose of that peculiarly truthful mixture of resolve and loathing. But Caravaggio knew how awkward it is to handle a heavy sword like that, and so Judith is sawing inexpertly through the tendons with a compressed look of disgust, watched by that eager crone of a nurse. One of the commonest themes of killing in Christian art was David and Goliath, and Caravaggio often returned to it. About death, he was very seldom wrong. It obsessed him, but he didn't invest it with glamour, because he so obviously knew what it looked like. This is probably the least gung-ho David in Italian art, and he's manifestly put off by the gross, dripping trophy in his hand. This is probably the least gung-ho David in Italian art, and he's manifestly put off by the gross, dripping trophy in his hand. It's thought that Goliath was a self-portrait, and some critics believe that the David is too, but of a younger Caravaggio. Whether such allegories were meant or not, one is left with his psychological insight, and that was more real in its perceptions than any other Italian painters of the time. This Narcissus, turned into a circle by his reflection in the pool, still wears Giorgionesque costume, brocade, slashed hose, but the thickness of the dark around him gives his image a peculiar drama by stressing the isolation of self-love. What Caravaggio now needed was a great occasion to rise to, a big commission that would consolidate his work. And the Cardinal del Monte got it for him. On July 23rd, 1599, he was commissioned to paint 2 scenes from the life of St. Matthew for the Contarelli Chapel of the Church of San Luigi dei Francesi in Rome. A third was called for 2 years later, and these were the pictures that made his name. The painter of boys and fruit now became a famosissimo pittore, a heavyweight. The first of his proofs was the calling of St. Matthew. It's set in what seems to be a real room, and we may be looking at Caravaggio's own studio in Palazzo Madama. Christ has come in on the right with an apostle. He points, and behind him, from a window out of frame, high up on the wall, a beam of light breaks in and washes over the group at the table. St. Matthew and his young companions dressed in those familiar Giorgione costumes. The light is transfiguring. It's a blaze of grace. What an invention. Caravaggio paints a supernatural event without losing one fraction of the density of real life. There's a subtle division between the worldly figures at the table, dressed in modern costume, and the spiritual presences of Christ and his companion St. Peter, whom Caravaggio has turned into messengers from a point outside of historical time by clothing them in classical draperies. Moreover, some of the drama of the picture, at least, comes from Caravaggio's throwaway lines. He resists the temptation to put Christ in the foreground, and all we see of him is the head, the shoulder, and the imperious pointing hand. So one tends to read the picture from left to right, starting with the group at the table and then, like them, discovering the source of their astonishment. The next part of the narrative was St. Matthew and the Angel. Caravaggio did two versions of it, and this was the first. It was destroyed by a bomb during World War II, but it had never got into the Contarelli Chapel anyway because the priests rejected it. Why? Decorum. St. Matthew looks like a puzzled bumpkin learning his ABCs, and those intrusive feet of his would have been right above the high altar. But mainly it's thought the picture was rejected because of the winsome sexiness of the angel whispering sweet revelations in his ear. No matter, the Marchese Giustiniani bought it to go with his victorious love, and Caravaggio did another version, this one, with less body contact. The figure of St. Matthew writing his gospel on that ordinary trestle table has a tremendous and antique gravity. He might equally well be Cato or Socrates. And again, the darkness around him gives those folds in the red toga a density like sculpture. No doubt, the vision of the angel flying down in that swirl and flutter of drapery was inspired by some classical carving that Caravaggio had seen in Rome, and yet how very unclassical the angel's gesture is. You could see it in a shop or a tavern. No doubt Caravaggio did. Elementary teaching. 1, 2, 3. But the painting on which Caravaggio's future development would turn was the martyrdom of St. Matthew. It's a bewildering picture, a sublime hodgepodge. The setting is almost illegible. A church altar, steps, a suggestion of gloomy columns. An angel writhes down on a very unconvincing cloud to give the palm of martyrdom to St. Matthew, who is prostrate on the steps, while an almost naked executioner prepares to skewer him. This splendid figure of the carnefice, the headsman, is the hub of the picture. Round him there's a churning and flickering of limbs and bodies in a black void. They're all falling back in various degrees of terror. The witnesses, whoever they are, in their modern dress. The half-naked giants, whoever they may be, at the bottom corners of the picture. The panicking boy turning to run. And the only one who seems not to be in shock is right in the background, and his face is Caravaggio's self-portrait. He wanted to make an elaborate show of his tenebroso, the lights and the darks. The light is as abrupt as a flash photo. It freezes the gestures with what looks to us like documentary reality. You're aware of 1/60th of a second of time. What's more, the light does not model the bodies it falls on, it snatches them into view. It slides over a form to a certain line, and then it stops, and the dark begins. For his darkness isolates gesture, movement, the grimace of mouths and the splaying hands, and raises the psychological pitch of every expression. Caravaggio finished the martyrdom of St. Matthew in 1600, and when the three big pictures were hung in the Contarelli Chapel, they did exactly what he hoped they would do. They made him famous. From this point on, the imitators multiply and the commissions pour in and the criticism mounts. Pietro Bellori complained that now began the representation of disgusting things. Some artists began to revel in filth and deformity. If they had to paint armour, they chose the rustiest. The costumes they painted were stockings and breeches and large hats, and they gave all their attention to the wrinkles and defects of the skin and the outlines, depicting knotted fingers and limbs disfigured by disease. Now, in the event, all that the Caravaggisti could imitate was the shell and stage props of Caravaggio's work, and the real lesson to be drawn from his art, that extraordinary overlap between epiphanies and ordinary substances, needed a Velázquez or a Georges de la Tour or a Rembrandt to carry it on and complete it. What the first wave of Caravaggio's Roman imitators must, I suppose, have been looking at, apart from the genre scenes, was the next big set of commissions that he did, the martyrdom of St. Peter and the conversion of St. Paul for the Chirazi Chapel in Santa Maria del Popolo in 1600. Today, the martyrdom looks formal, even classical, a big tilted X. It's been said of Caravaggio that he never painted rhythms, only vectors, lines of force, and there's perhaps no painting of which this is truer. It's like a heroic diagram. The rope passing over that straining back indicates one arm of the X, and sight lines reinforce the other. The executioner looking at Peter's head while he's trying to heave the cross up vertical. St. Peter staring at the nail in his hand, defying the pain. But the details annoyed some people, particularly the feet of that executioner. They're labourers' feet, calloused and dirty, and to us that's part of the truth of the picture. When he turned to the conversion of St. Paul, Caravaggio showed how completely he had escaped the narrative conventions of his time. A professional artist in 1600 would expect Paul to be the central figure, reeling backwards perhaps, but still on horseback, an equestrian monument to faith. Not Caravaggio, though. Again, he chose the climax of the action, for the voices spoken from the sky, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And the future apostle has been struck from his horse and lies on the ground, pinned like a beetle by that shaft of light. But the radiance that changes Paul's life is also quite matter-of-fact light, illuminating the brow of his groom and the side of his skewbald horse. This image is so entire, so compressed, that at first you don't notice how it bears the marks of the studio. A critic of narrative might object to the way that the groom is absorbed in holding the horse's head. He doesn't notice Paul on the ground. Caravaggio does not trouble to conceal the fact that he's brought a horse into the studio and an ostler to hold it. No matter. The intensity with which he paints the light, mediating between the natural and the supernatural, won't be approached by any European artist until Rembrandt. But in what sense was he a realist? Realism's a very relative word at one time or another. After all, it's been stretched to cover such exceedingly dissimilar figures as Velázquez and Bruegel and Courbet, Sir Alfred Munnings and the American photorealists, as well as Caravaggio himself. Realism, in any case, does not mean an unedited, comprehensive transcription of reality. It can't possibly mean that, because every second of the day the world is drumming a steady tattoo on your eyeball, and most of it you edit out. There'd be no way of dealing with all that information. So what realism comes down to, inevitably, is choice. Now, when the choices are consistent, we begin to speak of style. But the limits of choice vary from painter to painter, and from society to society, and they're always limits of choice vary from painter to painter and from society to society, and they're always set by a predisposition to certain clusters of ideas and attitudes and inherited objects, shapes, notions, images, in short, by culture. There are times when you'd think that he was playing a game with the definition of realism. He was fond of things that stuck out at your eye or hung over the edge of a table, like the fruit basket in the supper at Emmaus. They became a little more real. They threatened to pop out of the fictional space of the painting into the real space that the viewer occupies. He did the same with St. Matthew's stool, which is ready to tip and fall out of the picture. Again, you have it more ponderously in the big muscular figures in the martyrdom of St. Matthew, which lurch towards you so forcibly, one backwards, the other forwards, that they seem ready to fall into your world. Nevertheless, the realist and the expressionist don't make up the whole sum of Caravaggio, particularly not of the man who painted the big, formal altarpieces of the early 1600s, like this Madonna of the Rosary. But what makes the elaborate doxology credible and human is, again, the gestures, those expressive, supplicating hands. That Caravaggio had seen on the streets. It's how Italians still use their hands, and Ernst Gombrich compared it to a newspaper photograph of Sicilian peasants taken after an earthquake in 1968. But the hands aren't simply naturalistic. Their movements are designed as if by a choreographer to signify mediation. First, the pleading and chaotic gestures of the faithful on earth, and then the supplication, as it were, passed on by the saint with that calm spreading of his palms towards Mary. Possibly the Virgin and Child are too official looking, and Caravaggio is never as convincing with these plump, smug curves as he is with the marks of age. Nevertheless, his project was to give traditional motifs the immediacy of real life, rather than dignify the actual with fragments of the classical. And once there was a perfect standoff between the two, this Madonna, leaning very elegantly against a pilaster, with those two wrinkled and almost incongruously devout plebeians adoring her. It seems, though, that the Popolo Romano did not identify at once with their image here, if one can trust Caravaggio's memoirist Baglione.
In the first chapel of St. Augustine, turning to the right inside, he painted a full-size Madonna di Loreto with two pilgrims, one with muddied feet, the other wearing an unstitched cap, and because of these unworthy levities, the common folk looked at them and could be heard to laugh and cackle.
Compared to the pilgrims, the Madonna looks wooden, but perhaps she was meant to, since the cult of the shrine of the Madonna at Loreto centred around a miraculous statue of the Virgin Mary, which, like a benevolent female version of Mozart's Commendatore, was said to come alive when venerated. Anyway, Caravaggio liked his invention of that odd pose with her head craning forward and stretching along Picasso-like horizontal from shoulder to neck, because he used it again the next year, 1605, in a painting called the Madonna dei Palafrenieri, commissioned for the Vatican by a largely ornamental body of noblemen called the Papal Grooms. It's an image of the destruction of heresy. The Virgin, as traditionally she is meant to do, being conceived without sin, stamps her foot on the head of the Protestant reptile, and the little Lord Jesus learns to put his bare foot over hers. Meanwhile, St. Anne looks on. It's an impeccably doctrinal picture, completely in the spirit of the Council of Trent. And even that contrast between the young and the old woman, which Caravaggio was so fond of, he repeated it in a painting of Salome and her nurse, which is now in the Escurial, even that had a precedent in the paintings of Leonardo. One wouldn't suppose that there was anything to object to, and yet, curiously enough, there must have been something, because the painting was refused. But Caravaggio was not really an artist who went well with committees. He could convince a single patron with imagination, somebody like Giustiniani or the Cardinal, but when it came to committees, whether they were composed of priests or laymen, it didn't matter much. His work was always running into some lowest common denominator of taste and conservatism. And this was the fate that befell his big project from 1605, the death of the Virgin. This is one of the greatest lamentations in all Western art. It could have been so bombastic, but it's not, and for that we have to thank Caravaggio's sense of gesture and facial expression. In the left background, the apostles are talking distractedly, but as they get nearer, the faces become more concentrated, more solemn, and at the end of that sloping ramp of heads, you have that bald dome sunk in grief, rubbing his eyes, with the man on the right watching and not knowing what to say, as if a wave of mourning had built up and is now breaking silently over the Virgin's corpse. That body was the trouble. It provoked the friars who commissioned it for the church of Santa Maria della Scala in Trastevere to refuse the painting on the grounds that the Madonna was painted from the bloated corpse of a prostitute who'd been fished out of the Tiber. Possibly it was, though the bare feet of the Virgin and the Apostle may equally well refer to the order of friars, the discalced or barefoot Carmelites. Yet when it was publicly shown in April 1607, the hundreds of painters in Rome who flocked to see it were looking at a virtually classical painting, spare, silent and grave. By 1607, he was in a peculiar fix. He was both the most talked about painter in Rome and a criminal exiled from the city. From 1600 on, he'd been accumulating imitators like fleas, and among them was a timid, late Mannerist named Giovanni Baglione, who painted this dark and flossy allegory of sacred and profane love as a kind of pendant to Caravaggio's victorious Cupid. Baglione could not get anywhere near Caravaggio's harsh poetry. None of the Caravaggisti really could. But he could add some sugar to it. And as a writer, he proceeded to add his meed of vinegar.
You will please note that I am a painter by profession, and I have been practicing in Rome for many years. And it came to pass that I made a picture of the resurrection, and this picture was hanged in the chapel of the Church of Jesus. And when it was uncovered on the day of Easter's resurrection, the defendants I have summoned felt envious and said that Michelangelo de Caravaggio should have been commissioned, not I. And Michelangelo and Honorio Longo and Orazio, his friends, spurred by envy, went on slandering and criticizing my pictures, and they wrote some verses which dishonor and abuse me. And the verses were delivered to various and divers persons.
Throughout these years of success in Rome, Caravaggio was in constant trouble with the law. His landlady sued him for back rent. His former friend Baglione sued him for libel and won, so that he had to spend part of his time under house arrest thereafter. Then, being bisexual, he was constantly getting into fights over women with various rivals and pimps. He wounded a guard at the Castello Sant'Angelo. He was arrested for carrying an unlicensed sword, and one night in 1604, he had very nearly killed a waiter in an inn called the Osteria del Moro. This minion had brought Caravaggio a dish of half a dozen artichokes cooked in oil and half a dozen in butter, and the painter asked him which were which. "Taste them and you will see," said the waiter. And we all get service like that on occasions, but seldom do we respond to it as briskly as Caravaggio did. He leapt up, laid the man's cheek open with the metal dish, and then tried to skewer him with his sword. And in one lawsuit after another, Caravaggio was accused of everything: rowdiness, scuffles, rudeness. Caravaggio was accused of everything: rowdiness, scuffles, rudeness, murder.
Begging your permission, I shall now relate how on Friday of the last week at about 3 a.m. in the morning, having left the academy after a session of studies, I was walking with Signor Orazio Bianchi on my way to the Crofa. From the corner of the street, the defendant suddenly appeared, brandishing a cane, and began to thrash me most violently. I protected myself by draping my body with a cloak, which, as you can now see, was left badly torn, whereupon he ran away, and it was then that I recognized him. The said Michelangelo came last night at about 5 o'clock and threw stones at my window and broke it all. Later, he returned with a gang of friends and stopped at the corner of the street playing loudly with a guitar. The time could have been 1 a.m. I was walking along Piazza Navona with Signor Mariano, a notary of Vicario. The precise spot where it happened can be described as opposite the Spanish embassy, where, turning to the left, it runs towards the Rinaldi Palace. Of a sudden, Signor Mariano fell to the ground. I turned my head and saw a man brandishing a sword, who ran away in the direction of the palace of the very illustrious Cardinal del Monte and disappeared in an alley. He held to one shoulder a black coat. I bent down and asked Signor Mariano, "What is the matter?" He was bleeding from a wound on his head. He then got up and said, "I have been murdered, and word will go to Monsignor the Governor that nobody but Caravaggio has done this to me, and this is the truth."
Probably Caravaggio wasn't all that much worse than 1,000 other bullies and rowdies in Rome, but his fame as a painter had made him extremely conspicuous. And in the spring of 1606, he made the blunder that was going to cost him his Roman career. Because one day in late May, he was playing paddleball here on the Campo Marzio with some friends, 4 to a side, and there was a squabble over the score, which became a brawl, and Caravaggio stabbed a young man called Ranuccio Tomasoni in the groin, cutting his femoral artery and killing him. So although he was wounded himself, Caravaggio was obliged to flit quickly out of Rome rather than face a murder charge with 6 witnesses on top of his already rather long police record. He headed south towards Naples, and a papal edict of banishment promptly followed him. For a while, he managed to take refuge on the estates of Prince Marzio Colonna, here at Zagarolo. In return, he painted the prince a second, rougher version of the Supper at Emmaus. And this was the first of a series of paintings that Caravaggio, in his last years, would make on the run. At the end of 1606 or the beginning of 1607, he arrived in Naples. In Naples, Caravaggio was safe. The city was not part of the Papal States, and so consequently he could not be extradited back to Rome for trial. And even though it meant setting up a whole new studio here, which was certainly irksome, he could work in safety, which he proceeded to do. And the first of the big commissions that he did was this painting here, an enormous job, over 13 feet high, a commission from the Piemonte della Misericordia, a charitable organization of noblemen in Naples. For charity at that time was a matter of private donation rather than public funding. They paid Caravaggio the immense sum of 400 gold ducats for it, and they got, in return, what can only be said from the religious point of view to be a somewhat unorthodox painting. Caravaggio represented the 7 main works of charity as the Gospels described them. A corpse being carried out by torchlight, bury the dead. A woman is giving an old man in jail her breast to suck, a conflation of comforting the prisoner and feeding the hungry. A figure drinking from the jawbone of an ass, give drink to the thirsty. An innkeeper welcoming St. James, shelter the pilgrim. St. Martin gives his cloak to a beggar, clothe the naked. A leg and a very dimly seen crutch indicate that you must care for the sick. It's a puzzling picture congested with annoying shorthand. Some of the figures are fragmented and the narrative couldn't be harder to follow. No doubt some of that was due to Caravaggio's way of working without preliminary designs. Not one authenticated drawing by him has survived, and he painted big compositions like this directly onto the canvas, scratching the outlines into wet underpaint with a metal point instead of drawing everything carefully in advance. Such methods don't make for clear storytelling, and yet the 7 Acts of Mercy is a tremendous feat of observation. Once again, Caravaggio's eye for gesture and expression, working through the dark, has made its rhetorical point. It's almost, if not quite, the world's first masterpiece of social realism. Now, if the confraternity had wanted to make a theological point and show how charity among the church militant on earth appeals to the church triumphant in heaven, I suppose it would have been a trifle puzzled by the result, because there is, in fact, so little traffic between the earthly and divine in Caravaggio's painting. The reason is, I presume, that he was out to make just as concrete an image of social suffering as he possibly could. And so the figures are going through their various allegorical motions of charity and of need with a complete self-absorption and an utter indifference to what's going on in the top half of the picture. Not one of them pays the slightest attention to this epiphany that's coming through the roof at them in this dim, stony space, this pair of embracing angels with their wings forming a kind of window frame inside which the Madonna and her child sit inspecting the scene below. In 1608, Caravaggio left Naples and went to Malta, and he must have hoped that by ingratiating himself with the Maltese Knights, that leading order of Catholic chivalry which ran the island, he would get a papal pardon. At first, things went well. He painted the portrait of the Grand Master of the Knights, aloft of Vignacourt, smug and resplendent in his gold-inlaid ceremonial armour. Over the years, he'd painted several images of St. Jerome writing and meditating, surrounded by his attributes: the red cloak, the scowl, the darkness of the hermit's cave. He made this one of his quintessential subjects, the body experienced as tragic, that immense pathos of old corded muscles under the wrinkled skin. He paints middle age and old age in a spirit equally compounded of detachment, awe, done for the Cathedral of Valletta. And in return, Caravaggio was dubbed a Knight of Grace. The Cathedral of St. John, with its magnificent inlaid tomb slabs of the knights, epitomised the wealth of Caravaggio's new patrons. In 1608, Caravaggio produced the climactic painting of his career for the cathedral, the beheading of St. John. By now, the jarring drama of the early paintings has been replaced by a meditation on death which is as grave and measured as any of the masterpieces of neoclassicism. The Baptist is already dead. The action is over. The executioner has him by the hair and he's drawing a little knife to finish the beheading. Salome bends forward with her dish. Her wrinkled nurse looks on. The figures complete an arch. It's almost the same composition as the calling of St. Matthew 9 years earlier, except that the figures of Christ and Peter have been replaced by two prisoners watching from the window. The groups form large, sombre structures, and they're set, for once, in a legible architectural space. That dark arch of the prison wall repeats the curve of the group below it and is balanced by the yawning rectangle of the window. The Baptist is almost any victim, professionally killed on the bare stone of a prison yard. Caravaggio's signature is traced in his blood. It is the most Shakespearean of all his paintings, and there's a line uttered by Richard II that might be its epigraph. I have been studying how I may compare this prison where I live unto the world. The Grand Master de Vignacourt rewarded him for it with, among other things, a gold collar and 2 slaves. But then Caravaggio's luck slipped. He fought with one of the Maltese knights and was clapped in prison. And in the meantime, the knights began to wake up to why Caravaggio had really fled from Rome, and they set up a criminal commission to investigate him. Caravaggio guessed what would happen, and he managed to escape from the fortress at Valletta. He got on board a felucca and fled to Syracuse in Sicily, and the knights formally expelled him as a corrupt and foul member of their order, and de Vignacourt, who was outraged, sent a pair of assassins after Caravaggio to finish him off or bring him back. Caravaggio didn't feel safe in Sicily, and he was right. He wasn't safe anywhere. He stayed a while in Syracuse and visited a famous cave near the city, which, according to local legend, was an antique prison built by Dionysius. It's an interesting footnote to Caravaggio's paranoid frame of mind that he concluded the place had been made in the shape of an ear so that jailers could hear every word the prisoners said. And ever since Caravaggio's visit, it has been called the Ear of Dionysius. But the last act had begun. A panicky flight round southern Italy, chased by the Grand Master's hounds, doing paintings on the run. No artist probably has ever worked under more pressure. Yet Caravaggio has one extraordinary image left in him. In Messina, in 1609, he paints the resurrection of Lazarus. Of all his paintings, this one is closest to the spirit of Masaccio. It's as if he'd gone back to the beginning. The cemetery wall has become a tall, greyish-brown void that rises above the frieze of figures, and more than half the painting actually is empty. Caravaggio has returned to the pointing Christ of the St. Matthew cycle, but now the movement of his arm and the folds of his toga have acquired a stupendous, archaic authority. The talking heads behind him might have been lifted from Masaccio's frescoes in the Brancacci chapel. And Lazarus himself is like a marble warrior coming to life, the legs rigid, but the arms flushed and thrust out with vitality. That group, with Lazarus' sister bending over his face and trying to breathe life into him, is as compressed and as concentrated as any Roman bas-relief. For him, classicism was not a dead hand. It was an inheritance that had to be reinvented in the presence of nature. And that's what made him so foreign to the Mannerists and so great and stimulating an artist. The resurrection of Lazarus shows once again that he had no wish to abandon the past, but he did want to make it the receptacle of the most concrete experience and the most exalted feeling. And perhaps more than any other work of his, this one makes you wonder what he might have done if he had lived. He couldn't keep up such a pitch of intensity all the time. Later, in 1609, he moved to Palermo and painted this Nativity with St. Lawrence and St. Francis. It's a much more conventional painting, less ecstatic, rather more highly finished than Lazarus. The Holy Family in their stable with their attendant saints, the child lying in a kind of protective cocoon of dark drapery, and an angel flying down from heaven with a scroll. But he couldn't stay in Sicily forever. It was a provincial dump, and he was still a Roman success, the most celebrated painter of his generation, and he needed the banishment from Rome revoked. Even more, he needed de Vignacourt off his back. So on the 20th of October, 1609, he set off for Naples, and there he painted his last pictures. Two of them were Salome's with the head of John the Baptist, his now obsessive image, and within it, the motif of the old and the young woman conjoined as if growing schizophrenically from the same body. The last was a flagellation, perhaps the most sadistic and despairing picture he had ever produced. Christ's body has none of the ecstatic skinniness of Lazarus. It's sleek, radiant with light, and vulnerable. Beside it, the flogger on the left is almost a caricature of evil, a monkey-faced, gap-toothed little runt who clearly loves his job. The one on the right is all brute force. It's more a painting of types than of individuals, and it may be partly autobiographical. Outside a thieves' hangout called the Locanda del Cerrillo, Caravaggio encountered some thugs, possibly the ones sent by the Knights of Malta. They did him over so thoroughly that he was left unrecognizable, but they did not quite kill him, even though he was reported dead in Rome. Caravaggio must have been badly scared and ill and weak, but he knew that his old friends and patrons were lobbying for the pardon, and he decided to move closer to Rome. He didn't want to go straight into papal territory, and so he found himself a passage to Porto Ercole, north of Rome and Spanish-controlled. He also hoped to get past the Knights of Malta, who presumably knew by now that he was still alive. In July 1610, he landed there. The measure of his fear was that before quitting Naples, he packed his painting of Salome with the head of John the Baptist and sent it off to Malta to placate, he hoped, the implacable Grand Master. And then he got on the felucca and set sail for Porto Ercole, for the shivering ague, and for this grey beach, and for the last interminable darkness. And 3 days after he died, his pardon finally arrived.